bottom of page 9 going to page 10, the feeling of boundless loathing that had begun to oppress and sicken his heart while he was still only on his way to the old woman, now reached such proportions and became so clearly manifest that he did not know where to flee from his anguish. There's a lot of foreshadowing of leitmotifs here, this idea of things being manifest, anguish, and not knowing where to go. Marmeladov is about to say, every man needs a place where he can go, and that's an idea. And Raskolnikov is about to go into the tavern. He had never gone into taverns before, but his head was spinning now, and he was tormented by a burning thirst. This burning thirst, is metaphorical. It's not a burning thirst for murder. It's not a burning thirst to exercise his ideal of stepping over. It's a burning thirst for salvation. He's already guilty. He's already compounding the interest in his mind, in his soul, and he already needs salvation before the crime has even taken place. But this idea of being made manifest, this idea of not being able to get away with anything, that which is hidden will be revealed. And if you turn to your New Testament in the King James Bible, we're talking Matthew 10:26, Jesus' words, "Fear them not, therefore, for there is nothing covered that shall not be revealed, and hid that shall not be known. What I tell you in darkness, that speak ye in light. And what ye hear in the ears, that preach ye upon the housetops. And fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him that which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing? And one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father. But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear ye not, therefore, ye are of more value than many sparrows." The whole of chapter 10 is very, very interesting, but we want to really focus on this idea of there is nothing covered that shall not be revealed. There is nothing hid that shall not be known. And we go on to page 11, and I want you to think, as we continue to go forward, this idea that one's crime is also one's gateway to salvation. Okay? How can you have salvation without a crime? You can't just have it isolated. You cannot be completely pure and good. You can have pure sentiments and pure sensibilities and pure ideas. But salvation is almost like a salve to some crime that you've done. Beginning of chapter 2, Raskolnikov was not used to crowds, and, as he has already been mentioned, fled all company, especially of late, but now something suddenly drew him to people. Something new was happening in him, as it were, and with that a certain thirst for people made itself felt. And now he's wishing to draw a breath in another world, whatever it might be, and despite all the filthiness of the situation, it was with pleasure that he now went on sitting in the tavern. And yet he ostensibly hates cleanliness, and yet he's in the epicenter of filthiness. The tavern is the moral or immoral center of Dostoyevsky's world, the world of Raskolnikov and Crime and Punishment, as is the Haymarket, which is a hotbed for prostitution and crime. He is continually drawn to these locations. He's never been to a tavern before, and yet he's drawn to it. He's drawn to sit there among the stench. When he doesn't know what he's doing and he's in a bit of a fever dream and he's wandering about in a daze, not knowing where he's going, without aim, he ends up at the Haymarket, hotbed of criminality. And he talks about the atmosphere being evil, smelling, and becoming drunk in 5 minutes from the air alone. And that's interesting because it brings in this idea of environment. Why is St. Petersburg such a psychologically complex character in its own right? Location as character. So the idea of how much do we really get to choose our choices? The decision to murder, for example, a decision to do this, to choose our principles, our morals. How much is the choice really ours? Now, there's 2 types of existential philosopher. There's the defeatist kind, Sartre, Camus, and then there's the more positive side, Maslow, Viktor Frankl. I don't think Maslow's particularly positive. Frankl is. Frankl says that we are bound and determined and conditioned by people around us, society, our parents, the values instilled in us. Of course we're conditioned, but we get to choose our choice. Between stimulus and response there is a space. We get to choose. That's the positive side of things. Dostoyevsky, I'm not sure, you tell me, does he think that we get to choose our choices, or does he think that the environment we're born into corrupts us? And then you can see Dostoyevsky's technique of creating suspense, and this is also why the book is somewhat of a detective novel, an early one anyway. look at the very bottom of page 11. Later, the young man recalled this first impression. So he continuously does this. I'll point it out a little bit as we go on the way, but there's this idea of later. So he's telling a story, but we're not of that time. That's not our present. If we're following Hofstede's cultural dimensions or Trompenaar's cultural values, time can be different depending on the society we're born into. If you're born into a culture like the UK or America, you are born into a culture of sequential time. Okay, so that's where the future is ahead of us. Time is behind us. We look back over memories, reflexively thinking back, and the future is important. So it's important for us to keep deadlines and meet them, and the best is always yet to come. But many cultures, France, Japan, and I think Russia, a lot of cultures that are collectivist rather than individualistic, they have a more synchronous sense of time, where tradition is important. The past is important. The past and the present are as important as the future. And we can see Dostoyevsky creates suspense because we know something has happened, and we obviously already know that he's murdered her. But what we really want to find out is, does he repent? Does he do penance? Does he find salvation? That's the real hunt. And the fact that Dostoyevsky is able to keep it at fever pitch, this thoroughly fast pace all the way through to the end, at least all the way through to the epilogue, is just testament to his technique as a writer. Later, so we're like, ooh, what's happened? Yeah, before anything has even happened, we know something's happened. So we have a very interesting relationship with time in Dostoyevsky's novels. Then we meet Marmeladov, and look at the description of him. Okay, he was a man already past 50, average height, solid build, with some grey in his hair and a large bald spot, with a yellow, even greenish face, swollen from constant drinking, and with puffy eyelids behind which his reddish eyes shone, tiny as slits, but lively. Yet there was something very strange in him. His eyes seemed even to be lit with rapture. Perhaps there were sense and reason as well, but at the same time, there seemed also to be a flicker of madness in them. This idea of being lit with rapture. And we'll see, preceding the crime that's going to make one consumed by guilt is a sense of revelry and rapture. Again, we talked about Freud. If you buy into this idea that Dostoyevsky actually wished his father dead, there was a small moment when he learnt of the murder of his father, and actually he doesn't much comment upon this in his personal lives. Dostoyevsky was quite prolific in writing letters, journal entries. He doesn't say almost anything about the death of his father, but Freud seems to think that what he does say attests to the fact that there was a small moment of joy and relief when he heard of his father's death, and that joy creates guilt. Hearing of one's father's death, perhaps many people can, if they're very honest with themselves, identify with the sense of relief that might come with. If you've not had a good father, you might think, thank goodness, the tyrant is dead. Now a new king can step forward and rule properly. But that creates guilt. How guilty would you feel if you were raised, let's say, Roman Catholic, and you go into a church? Imagine the thought of this, the blasphemy behind this. Even if you've come out the other side of the religious tunnel and you find yourself atheistic, agnostic, more spiritual, secular, whatever, you're not Roman Catholic. Imagine going into a church or whatever temple or place of worship that is part of your religious upbringing, if you had one, and flipping off the crucified Christ. Imagine standing there before the altar and telling the figure of God that you've been raised under, telling him where he can go. Imagine swearing at a deity, the deity that your parents believe in. That's a heavy amount of guilt. And we do feel a lot of guilt when we confront our parents. And particularly son to father is a particularly tumultuous, torturous relationship. A rift between son and father is extremely tragic, because it's a rift between one's God. So anyway, there's this feeling of joy that precedes the guilt. And we're meeting Marmeladov. What did you think of Marmeladov? If you can get through part 1 and you're voraciously inhaling it and you're hurtling through the book, you might have needed to get through the monologues. Now, a lot of people say they love the monologues, and I can attest to that. But they can be a bit of a slog to get through. But I think rereading Marmeladov is really interesting. Right, and when we meet Marmeladov, we're also being introduced to a couple of different things. We've already touched upon this idea of that being hidden, being made manifest, bringing the light to it. But he also says, if you look at page 14, and he talks about hopelessness, he says, out of compassion, he says, in our time, compassion is even forbidden by science, as is already happening in England, where they have political economy. Now, what exactly is he referring to here? Now, I think he's touching upon this idea of social physics, which was pioneered by the man who came up with the BMI, the body mass index, and many other things. A very intelligent man called Adolf Quetelet. And basically he wanted to understand the statistical underlying laws of different crimes. And he came up with this idea of the bell curve, where basically the extremes are representative of, extreme manifestations of whatever value you're evaluating. Height, for example. If we look at a bell curve for height, there's an average where the overwhelming majority of, say, men are 5'10", 11, or depending on the country, I don't know, what the average is offhand. And then it's at the extremes that you have the freaks on either side, the statistical anomalies, not freaks I don't mean that in a disparaging way, but the statistical freaks. Someone who's 7 foot tall, basketball players, someone who's 3 foot tall on either end. Okay, that's just for height. Now, Quetelet was talking about this and applying it to different vices like prostitution, talking about suicide, different, murder, criminality. And you can talk about this in poverty, you can talk about wealth gap and all that sort of thing. Now, people were outraged at the time because they wanted to buy into this idea of free will, that we choose our destiny. People really liked that notion, and at a time when meaning was completely yanked out from underneath us, people wanted to think that they were in charge of their destiny. And they also wanted, because this is the foundation of basically the penal system, if you do bad, you chose to do bad. Now we'll explore this more in Les Miserables, because Hugo, complete socialist, took real issue with what was going on at the time, but Russia was a little bit behind France when it came to social physics and the social sciences. This idea that we choose our fate. Okay. Now, if you can predict statistically criminality, now that doesn't mean that you are beyond choice. It doesn't mean fate is completely bestowed to you. You tick this box, this box, this box, and therefore you must be a criminal. No, I don't personally believe that. But of course, if you look at the statistics of criminality, if you look at the defining traits, But all that really tells me, personally, we're getting off a bit of a tangent here, all that tells me is that the way the penal system is set up in some countries needs to be re-evaluated. Now in England, we have a penal or justice system that's basically revenge. State-issued, government-mandated revenge. If you look at what the prisons look like, they're just holes where you do your time. And that's interesting if you think about the metaphor of doing time. Paying for time, that's your punishment, doing time, because time affords you a bit of space to think about what you've done, let your conscience work upon you. Now, if you look at the Scandinavian countries, look at how they outline their prison systems. These are countries that have better social order, in my opinion, than other democratic, so-called democratic countries like England and Canada and America. Their penal systems are not set up to punish, but they're set up to rehabilitate. Now, if we go the Quetelet route, and we're talking about social and physics and statistical predictions of criminality, one would say that some people are beyond saving, beyond salvation, beyond rehabilitation. That's a very defeatist route. Ultimately, I'm an idealist, and I'm optimistic, and I'm a romantic, and I would say that in the overwhelming majority of cases, whether this is society's fault, the environment's fault or not, whether it really is down to the individual, a lot of people who are in prison for hard time, for doing horrible things like murder or worse, are probably beyond rehabilitation. But I think with the right system, the right penal system, and Thomas More outlined this in Utopia as a response to Plato's Republic, we'll talk about this at some point, I think I'll do a podcast on Utopia. His idea of the penal system was a rehabilitation system where we educate, we give them opportunities, we help them unlearn whatever environmental influence predisposed them towards criminalities. And I think it might work in the minority of cases, but isn't that better than it not working at all? We'll get into this idea a little bit more with the idea of the trolley problem, okay, social physics. Let's talk about it now, because actually this feeds into the whole of crime and punishment, really. the idea of utilitarianism, where the needs of the individual are subservient to the needs of the whole. Okay, now this is really popular in collectivist societies, as we've touched upon. Russia is a collectivist society. Japan is a collectivist society. When a Russian person talks about going out with their friends, they really put emphasis on we, the aspect of we, and us. When a Brit or an American talks about it, it's I did this with these people. Okay, Russians talk about close friends as brothers. They talk about their cousins as brothers. They'll talk about friends as cousins. It's part of a family. That's a collectivist mindset. Now, the trolley problem, you probably know it. It's hard to think about and hard to wrangle, but essentially, just imagine you're overlooking a train track and a train is hurtling towards 5 people tied to a track. If you pull the lever, you can divert the train, and there's one person tied to a track, and you kill that one person. Now, a lot of people would say, of course, 5 lives are better than 1, and they would pull the lever. But would they? Because it's when you get involved. So some people who are for the death penalty, and I will never be pro-death penalty because I will never buy into this idea that a state that wants you to be moral, that wants you to not murder, will set the example by murdering. I don't think you can cut off violence in a society by doing violence. I don't think it's a good enough deterrent anyway. Those that will murder. I don't think they're going to think, well, I might die, I might be killed and hung, therefore. I don't think it particularly works like that. But a lot of people would say, all right, well, one life is obviously, I'd rather one person die than 5 people. But it's when you get involved. So if you're pro-death penalty, the question I put to you is, would you pull the trigger? Would you stand there in the firing squad? Would you pull the lever that hangs the man? Would you press the switch that turns the electric chair on? If so, why? Now we've found that it can be traumatic to kill somebody. You can get PTSD if you stab someone. Obviously, the closer you get to the action, the more traumatic it can be. But studies are coming out now that even drone strikes, which the major virtue or the major positive behind the drone strikes is that those issuing the strikes don't get PTSD because they're removed from the action, it's on the screen. Psychological studies show that they get the worst PTSD. When you bomb a Syrian village and you're behind the screen, you're not absolved from the guilt. Your conscience doesn't go away. You still get kept up at night, wondering about what you've done and whether it was right or wrong, how much you are to blame. This whole idea of following orders, environmental influence. It's let's take the trolley problem to an extreme. Okay, this is one put forward by a social philosopher in the 70s, and the problem is, let's imagine that there are 5 people who all need organs, different organs. One needs a heart, one needs a liver, one needs a kidney, and they're all going to die if they don't get the organs. But all 5 cannot get the organs, therefore they will die. Now, a surgeon knows this, and a young man, healthy, travelling through, comes for a regular routine checkup, and the surgeon or the doctor finds that they're in full health, and not only that they have every single organ needed by each of those people, and that they could save 5 lives. And not only that, no one would miss this traveller, this young man, and the surgeon would not be culpable, would not be held up, would not be discovered. He'd get away with murdering him and giving the organs to the 5 people. Utilitarianism, taken to the absolute extreme, the trolley problem taken to the absolute extreme, manifests like that. And I don't know, we can always talk about the benefits of collectivism versus individualism, and subverting the individual will to that of the collective. And this is a conversation we've, of course, been having a lot recently. But I don't know if I want to live in a society that's set up where if you take it to the logical, absurd extreme, such as the surgeon problem, if the foundation and the pinnacle of society, the bedrock of society, is a utilitarian one, where one life is dispensable so long as it saves 5, and it's constructed by people who buy into that, yet may not actually physically get involved. Now, with the track problem, what if you had to push the one on the track to save the 5? Would you do it? Now, if you were told that they were, without a shadow of a doubt, responsible for the track problem in the first place, you would not only push them, but you might feel morally obliged to do so, because you're not only saving the victims, but you're punishing the perpetrator. A lot of people say it's you getting morally involved. Okay, what right do you have when the track is on course to kill those 5 people? What right do you have to determine that the one life isn't as important as those 5 lives? individualism? What right do you have to actually change the switch? And therefore, you are responsible for the death of that one person. But are you responsible for the death of the 5 if you turn a blind eye and turn away? This is why it's so difficult. Personally, I don't want to be in society that thinks that the individual's rights are completely subservient to rights en masse. Because if you get it wrong, and this is why I'm anti-death penalty, if you get it wrong, the stakes are high. But anyway, this is what's happening at the time. And this paper by Adolf. It was a Quitilet. It was being translated into Russian, so it was at the forefront of everybody's discussion in towns, cities like St. Petersburg. And Quitilet also talked about, in his treatise on man, he talks about l'homme moyen. And now my French pronunciation is probably worse than my Russian pronunciation, but l'homme moyen, that is the average man. So this whole concept of the average man is gaining stock and currency in the time. Now, very interesting when we see that Raskolnikov's thesis is there's a split between ordinary men and extraordinary men. It's the Obermensch idea, the ordinary and the extraordinary. Are you ordinary and are you relegated? Are you damned and destined and fated to remain ordinary all of your life? Or can you step over and become extraordinary? These are the conversations they're having at the time, so no wonder it resurfaced in Crime and Punishment. And if we go on to page 15, Marmeladov, never mind, sir. I am not troubled by this wagging of heads, for everything is already known to everyone, and everything hidden will be made manifest. He's quoting Matthew 10:26. And then he goes on, I regard it not with disdain, but with humility. Let it be, let it be. Behold the man. Who's he quoting there? He's quoting John 19:5. Excuse me, young man, but can you, or no, to expound it more forcefully and more expressively, not can you, but would you venture, looking upon me at this hour, to say of me affirmatively that I am not a swine? We're going to go on to meet, by virtue of Marmeladov talking about her, we're going to meet Katerina Ivanovna, and then he goes on to talk about it's necessary that every man must have a place, one such place where he too is pitied, okay? And this idea of being born a brute, this idea of cleanliness is reinforced. But let's look at John 19:5. This is a scene in chapter 19. John talks about Christ being scourged, crowned with thorns, and beaten. And Pilate wants to release Jesus, but he's become overcome with the outrage of the Jews, and so he delivers him to be crucified. They cast lots for his garments. But the quote that Marmeladov is referring to is, Then Jesus came forth, wearing the crown of thorns, and the purple robe. And Pilate saith unto them, Behold the man. We're getting this Christ imagery come in. We're getting this imagery of journeying to Golgotha, carrying one's cross, journeying to be crucified. This idea that if we buy into Freud's idea, his psychoanalysis of Dostoyevsky's preoccupation with the criminal also being the redeemer, Raskolnikov does murder so we don't have to. Jesus dies for our sins. We're all sinners. St. Petersburg is a microcosm for the world at last. We all sin. But it's whether we take the burden and the guilt of the collective sin upon ourselves and are scourged for it with the crown of thorns, carrying the cross. It's interesting that St. John, it seems to be one of Dostoyevsky's favourites, and he'll touch upon a lot of preoccupations that we see in the Gospel according to St. John. If we see the very beginning of St. John, chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything that was made. This idea of word becoming flesh. First one speaks, or God speaks, and then it's brought into life. Words are highly influential. Words and thoughts even can be deeds. This is why Raskolnikov's guilt precedes the crime. It's like it's already taken place. All we have is our interior and our individual interpretation of everything around us. So if we're already thinking of doing it, we've essentially already done it. And we must be careful about what we say. There's the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the theory of linguistic relativity, that language influences thought. So we shouldn't say bad things, because if we say bad things, it will make us think bad things. If we say bad things, it may make us do bad things. We must really moderate what we say. This is not a call for censorship or censoring free speech. This is just a call for us cleaning ourselves up, cleaning up what we allow ourselves to say, cleaning up our interior. If we can moderate our words, we can moderate our thoughts, and that's tied into deeds. We'll look at Aristotle's ethics. Actually, we have a couple of podcasts on the Nicomachean ethics. It's character virtue. And we'll look at Marcus Aurelius a little bit and this idea of living a values-based life, living a life based on principles. If we can clean up our thoughts and what we say, our deeds will fall into place as well. So think well, speak well, and you'll do well. And the alternative is the opposite. Page 16, Marmeladov, he says, "It is not joy I seek, but sorrow only. I drink, for I wish doubly to suffer." Okay, buying into this idea of suffering, finding meaning in suffering. And when we apply Viktor Frankl's logotherapy to crime and punishment, you'll see that very often it is suffering itself is meaningful. Pain is meaningful. Do you understand, page 17, do you understand, my dear sir, what it means when there is no longer anywhere to go? No, that you do not understand yet. What does he mean? I think he's talking about the conscience. Like, you can flee the country, you can run away. And we'll see the Raskolnikov that kind of says, well, that's an option, but then he decides not to. Or he's convinced not to, but we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. When you have nowhere to go, that's when your conscience will always track you down and find you and corner you, and you will have a reckoning. You will be forced to deal with it one way or another. Okay, let's bop on a little bit and see a bit more symbology going on, all right? If you go to page 19, we have this introduction of the idea of kissing one's feet. We also have the washing of one's feet. You'll see in the Old Testament or the Jewish Bible and the Tanakh, this idea of washing one's feet, supplicating before a guest. Somebody comes on a journey through the dust. It's a nice thing to do, is to wash one's feet, but it's riven through with metaphorical meaning. We'll touch upon that as the novel goes on. And then there's this idea midway through 19, Marmeladov says Sonia or Sonechka comes to us mostly at dusk. And that's the interesting thing, salvation. And Sonia represents salvation, I believe. She represents a saving grace, a saving angel. Salvation comes to you at dusk. Okay, so she's working as a prostitute. She's prostituting herself, and there's going to be a bit of an overlap with Raskolnikov's sister. She's not an overt prostitute. She doesn't need a yellow card, but she is kind of selling herself or marrying herself away financially. It's a form of prostitution, and it's a form of sacrifice. So a prostitute obviously comes to us at dusk after she's done her work, but so does salvation. It's always darkest before the dawn. And then there's that touching upon the 68th Psalm, which is one of my personal favourites. As smoke is driven away, so drive them away. As wax melteth before the fire, so let the wicked perish at the presence of God. When do you take the form of wax, and when do you melt before the fire of God? When? I think in your interiority, in internal solitude, contemplation, your conscience working upon you. If you go to page 22, Marmeladov talks about reproach, and he says it hurts more. It hurts more, sir, when one is not reproached. Then he goes on, do you pity me now, sir, or do you not? And that's the question. At what point do we pity Marmeladov? At what point, if we do we pity Raskolnikov? At what point do we pity ourselves? What use is pity? What's the utility of pity in the wider scheme of everything? We talked about the trolley problem and touched upon collectivism and utilitarianism. Where does pity fit in with that? It hurts more when one is not reproached. Why? Because one reproaches themselves. We want to be punished. The criminal wants to be punished by society, the penal system, other people. Because the lack of punishment, the lack of reproach, means that we will reproach and punish ourselves if we are of that kind. And the punishment we can inflict upon ourselves is so much greater than the punishment anybody else can. We can be our own worst tyrant and slave driver. And he touches upon the Bible verse of Luke chapter 7, verse 47. Around that point, he says, come, I have already forgiven you once. I have forgiven you once, he will say, that's God. And now too your many sins are forgiven, for you have loved much. And he will forgive my Sonia. He will forgive her, I know he will, Till the day when I was with her, I felt it in my heart. And he will judge and forgive all, the good and the wicked, the wise and the humble. And when he has finished with everyone, then he will say unto us too, you too come forth. He will say, come forth, my drunk ones, my weak ones, my shameless ones. And we will all come forth without being ashamed, and stand there. And he will say, swine you are, of the image of the beast and of his seal, but come you too. Let's look at Luke 7:4-7. We can also look at Revelations at another point. We can look at a few different Bible verses. It's all very relevant. We can pivot more into this idea of feet washing and humbling oneself and being judged. But let's look at Luke 7:47. This part of the New Testament is really quite indicative of Jesus' teaching. It's indicative of a lot of his parables. Like, I'm reminded of the parable of the widow who gave 2 coins and the rich man gave 2 bags, and who gave more? Well, the widow, because that's everything that she had. I'm going to go on a little bit just before verse 47 of chapter 7 of Luke. Jesus has come to Mary Magdalene, a prostitute, and he says, let's say around verse 37, and behold, a woman in the city which was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at meat in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster box of ointment, and stood at his feet behind him, weeping, and began to wash his feet with tears, and did wipe them with the hairs of her head, and kissed his feet, and anointed them with the ointment. Now when the Pharisee which had bidden him saw it, he spake within himself, saying, this man, if he were a prophet, would have known who, and what manner of woman this is that toucheth him, for she is a sinner. And Jesus answering said unto him, Simon, I have somewhat to say unto thee. And he saith, Master, say on. There was a certain creditor which had 2 debtors. The one ought 500 pence, and the other 50. And when they had nothing to pay, he frankly forgave them both. Tell me, therefore, which of them will love him most? Simon answered and said, I suppose that he to whom he forgave most. And he said unto him, Thou hast rightly judged. And he turned to the woman and said unto Simon, Seest thou this woman? I entered thine house. Thou gavest me no water for my feet, but she hath washed my feet with tears, and wiped them with the hairs of her head. Thou gavest me no kiss, but this woman, since the time I came in, hath not ceased to kiss my feet. Mine head with oil thou didst not anoint, but this woman hath anointed my feet with ointment. Wherefore I say unto thee, her sins which are many are forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loveth little. And he said unto her, Thy sins are forgiven. And they that sat at meat with him began to say within themselves, Who is this that forgiveth sins also? And he said to the woman, Thy faith hath saved thee. Go in peace. I think we might end here on this part, because this gets us close to chapter 3, the first 3 chapters, and we've said a lot, but there's so much more to say. So in the next video, we'll take it up from the very end of chapter 3, because that's when we go into the house of Marmeladov and Katerina Ivanovna, and we're going to see this idea of pre-guilt exploited a bit more, this idea of man getting accustomed to everything. We'll explore the Dostoyevsky and double, that principle, and we'll talk about dream analysis a little bit, Turgenev, Pushkin's influence. We'll talk about the etymology of endurance. We'll see some more self-talk, and we'll talk about the bargains and contracts that we make whenever we do something. But for now, really meditate on that verse. Wherefore I say unto thee, her sins which are many are forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loveth little. Now I think, why did we read Anna Karenina first as preparation for Crime and Punishment? Because it fits. Now when you read Anna Karenina, you go through all the judgment and scorn, but you hopefully arrive at a position of understanding and forgiveness of all the characters. Or perhaps you don't. But we're going to wrestle with this idea of forgiveness. Forgiving someone much is an enduring theme in Crime and Punishment. And it's something that you might want to think about in the context of self-forgiveness. And we're going to see that with Raskolnikov. And I think confession, wrestling with confession and ideas of confession, is also wrestling with this idea of self-forgiveness. Let me know your impression so far of the first 3 chapters. How did you find the reading experience? Any insights are complete, they're not frivolous, there's no silly answers. I would really appreciate if you put any comments you can down below, and look forward to the next video, which is going to be a rounding off of part 1 from chapter 3 onwards, and then we'll get into part 2. I know a lot of people are storming ahead, people can't hold themselves back with Crime and Punishment. I remember my recommendation was 13 pages per day, which will get you 1 part per week, but a lot of people I know are storming well ahead. If you're not and you're taking it slow, that's okay too, but please do let me know your impressions of Crime and Punishment so far. Happy reading.